This is House Planning Help episode 194. Hello, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're interested in self-build, because I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century and trying to break down the major roadblocks that may get in our way. Coming up in this session, my guest is Paul Testa from Paul Testa Architecture, and we're going to be exploring project costs. Where will our money actually go? And how do we keep a firm grip on things? What are we forgetting? Yeah, we're talking everything budgets today. First, though, a little story, perhaps a word of caution, and maybe even something that might ring true. You might have experienced this perhaps on a lesser degree. In this position here of running a podcast which focuses on various different self-builds and trying to get information, I come across many stories. I don't think I've heard this so blatant before. It was about someone who is selecting some windows, and they've narrowed it down, that short list of 2 people. And they were chatting to one company, and the salesperson there said, well, I think I should tell you now to watch out for the other company on your shortlist because they're in financial difficulty and could well be filing for bankruptcy soon. Now that is something that, if true, you don't want to be dealing with someone who's about to go bankrupt. There are all sorts of extra issues to make sure that you're covered and you're not going to lose big sums of money. However, I thought I might be able to do a little further investigation. Disclaimer, I'm not a private investigator. However, after this investigation, I'm 95 to 99% sure that this is just a load of nonsense. So beware of salespeople, particularly when you just get that inkling, this isn't right. And maybe even on a lesser degree, you'll get this all the time. You're walking around a show, you chat to one person and they say this is the best way to do it. And then you go to the next person and they say, oh, no, don't listen to that. You should do this. So that, I think, is taking it to the extreme. And always, if you do feel a little bit uncomfortable about a piece of information, see if there's any other way. I know it takes time and none of us have a massive amount of time. Perhaps there's just some quick way of being able to validate what has been said. Let's get to our featured interview. Funnily enough, I thought about getting Paul Testa onto the podcast a couple of years ago when he entered a competition called Self-Build on a Shoestring. I think it was their practice that just wanted to demonstrate their skills, and this was actually creating a house built to Passive House standard for a ridiculously low sum. So I thought back then this would be good to discuss costs with Paul, and it didn't happen for whatever reason. However, I was reading one of his blog posts the other day on cost, and then I was suddenly reminded, well, let's just do this. We can still do it. Paul's had his own practice since 2010. It focuses on low energy buildings, and they have a speciality of gaining planning consent on some sites that have perhaps tried previously and not been successful, and then they manage to make things work. So all sorts of pearls of wisdom today. First, though, I asked him how he starts thinking about costs with his clients.
I mean, we're not sort of cost experts, and we're not cost consultants, so we have to use quite broad brush techniques to sort of look at cost and advise on cost. We start very broadly with a sort of £1,500 a square metre rate for a sort of new build bespoke architecture. So this is not your sort of bog standard developer specification, and it's not really high end, but it allows us scope to use materials as appropriate for the project. It allows us to design bespoke spaces and bespoke structures without worrying too much about the cost. We have developed recently a cost calculator for that early stage build cost to allow us to be a little bit more precise than just that 1,500. So it starts to allow us to feed in things like slope, which is something we deal with a lot in Sheffield, and the implications of an increased specification. And also the thing that's quite easy to forget, it's like external works. You kind of say to a client, well, you know, the £1,500 a square metre, it's 100 square metre build, so £150,000. Great. And then when the prices come back in, you've resurfaced the driveway and you've put a patio in and various other things, and the client goes, oh, well, that's actually more than you said it was going to be. So it's trying to flag that up, that you have to kind of include for everything, kind of asking those questions early doors, really, about what level of specification and what level of works they want to do other than just the new build or the retrofit works as well. So we have a retrofit rate in there as well.
For me, one of the surprises when I didn't know anything about this was that I thought you had this cost per square metre, happy days, you were talking about your finished house. And I think you've alluded to that, but it's worth pointing this out, that is not really everything, is it? You've got fees as a major thing on top of that. Why is that not in the cost per square metre? Because surely that is part of it.
Because the amount of service that you might require from an architect or from an engineer or from any other consultants, it isn't normally tied to the size of the project. It's more tied to the complexity of the project. So you could have a project that's only valued at, I don't know, £30,000 construction cost, and actually the amount of work that's involved in that might be no different to a project that's £100,000. So to tie fees to that square metre rate is very difficult to do. Normally what we advise is there's another sort of 30% on top of everything, on top of your construction cost for your fees, your planning fee, your building regulations fee, and any other costs. Obviously, that percentage will be greater the smaller the cost of the build, because, as I say, they're not all of these things scale. A planning application for a small extension is exactly the same cost as a planning application for a big extension.
And we haven't mentioned land, which is, again, step one. You're not going to build your new house if you haven't got land. So, yes, again, that doesn't really get factored in. And you've got to do this balancing act before. You don't know whether you're going to need any unusual surveys. You're looking at as much information of your site as possible. But all these sorts of things, there are certain things that you'll have a rough idea of. But even architects' fees, they vary a lot, don't they? As we got our quotes in, I was quite surprised how much they did vary.
Yes, yeah. And you can't give clients a sort of blanket, you need this much money for surveys, because, you know, they're dependent on the size of the site, the complexity of the site. It might be that we can do all of that measuring work and it doesn't add a huge amount to our fee, or you might need to get a separate surveying firm to come in, and the fees amongst them could vary quite hugely as well. So yeah, trying to kind of nail all those extras down is very difficult. But I think it's really important for us that we just raise the fact that they will exist, these costs, at an early stage, and that you need to factor something in so that when the costs do arrive, you're not surprised and you've got some sort of money set aside that will hopefully cover that.
And this is obviously something that you're trying to factor in at that buying land stage, because if you overspend on your land, then it's going to come out of the later project and things could go wrong. So utility costs is another one. How much do they tend to vary site to site?
Again, I mean, things like gas we found gas to actually be quite consistent and not hugely expensive, but we found the electricity supply can vary hugely depending on how much work they deem is involved in making your connection. So we've had quite big projects where the connection has been a few £100s, and then quite small projects where the connection's been thousands. Until you make that application to the utility company, you just don't know, because they're completely in control of that. You can't say, oh, I don't like your price, and go somewhere else. It's a captive market, unfortunately, and they can charge relatively what they want.
And I've got a couple of other things on my list here. One being insurance. What insurances might we have for our project, or could that fall under the contractor who's taking control of the situation?
Most contractors won't have sufficient insurance for the whole project. They will have insurance to cover their liabilities, so public liability insurance, employers' liability insurance. They'll have potentially insurance to cover all of their equipment on site, but it's unlikely that the building and potentially the materials that are yet to be put into the building are insured by their insurance. So you will definitely need insurance. So for a new build, you will need to procure sort of new insurance for the construction. For An existing building, you will already have insurance, but it's very unlikely that will cover the demands of a renovation project, and quite often they actually specifically exclude renovation within sort of standard homeowner insurance household policies. So some of them you can bring them up and they'll say, yeah, we can amend it and we're happy to cover you, and others will say, no, you've got to go elsewhere, and you might have to go to a sort of self-build insurance or something similar.
Are there any other types of insurance that we might consider?
So your contractor is covering public liability and their sort of employer's liability. Your architect should definitely have professional indemnity insurance and also public liability insurance, so that the implications of any design decisions in terms of their safety, etc., are dealt with. So it's the site and the buildings, kind of, they often call them an all risks insurance. But yeah, there's no other insurance that we'd normally recommend.
How does VAT fit into the equation? We're obviously talking about new build here, so we know we want to claim that back. We can't claim it back till the end. So how is that going to fit into the money we want to spend on our project?
It depends on your contractor, actually. It's quite common that certainly the larger contractors they won't pass on the cost of the VAT to the client. The client never sees that cost, and the contractor just claims it as part of their quarterly VAT payments. If you're buying elements direct, a manufacturer or a supplier, so quite commonly clients will want to procure, windows and doors, big bits of servicing kit, potentially a timber frame if they're building a timber frame building, those kind of large single ticket items to try and remove the contractor's overheads and profit from the equation. They might procure those direct, and then yes, they're going to have to maintain a certain chunk of money aside to cover that VAT cost until the end of the project. And yeah, so if your construction cost minus VAT is your absolute budget that you can borrow, you're going to have to sort of think very carefully about how you go about procuring the project. And yes, it might be that you have to put all of that through the contractor, who hopefully is then willing to not pass on the cost of the VAT, so that you don't have to, in the short term, find that money.
And you're talking about that situation where we're almost at our limit. That naturally brings in contingency. What's your experience of clients? Are they good at having that proper contingency?
Yes and no. I think at the beginning of a project, everybody has the best intentions to have contingency. And, our advice is always to have contingency. But quite often you get to a point when your prices have come back and you think, if only, if we just had that little bit more, we can do absolutely everything we want. And we don't have to compromise on anything, or our value engineering can be really kept to a minimum. And people really stretch themselves and go right up to that limit of both the kind of construction budget and their contingency. And that can be quite dangerous. It does depend. We try and minimize additional costs by ensuring that the correct investigation is done as early as possible, so that you understand the ground that you're going to be digging into. You understand whether there are any, if it's an existing building, is there any asbestos, all those kind of things. But you're never going to be able to completely mitigate risk. No two building projects are the same. Every construction project is kind of a prototype. It's not like, product design, where you refine and refine and refine the product until there are just no risks at all left. You're always dealing with the ground, you're dealing with weather, you're dealing with, there are always going to be unknowns. And so you've got to have something, a minimum of 5%, but more generously 10%. And if you've not spent your contingency, then you can have a nice party at the end, or pay for those really nice finishes at the end that you otherwise might not have been able to afford. So you might say, well, at the end, actually, we're going to go for that beautiful oak floor because our risks are dealt with. So yeah, there's definitely something to be said for having a substantial contingency.
Managing those expectations, do you do that the whole way through the process? At the beginning, try and keep them from going crazy? Or is it really when those tender documents and prices come back?
We try and do it throughout. As I say, we have limits as to what we can perceive in terms of cost. Obviously, the bigger something is, the more expensive it will be. And there are some materials that cost more than others, and complexity tends to cost more. So if you've got more fiddly junctions, but because we are interested in delivering sort of energy efficient buildings as well, we try and minimize that complexity from that standpoint anyway. Yeah, so we kind of have that early conversation about cost and about cost expectations. And we try, as we go through, to, it might be just that we agree there's a square meterage that we're sticking with. And if the client starts pushing you to make the building bigger, you need to flag that up, that another 5 square meters might not cost you £1,500 a square meter, but it will cost you something. So yes, we do try and manage that in the process, but we're not always successful. Sometimes prices come back completely unexpected. We do try and do, certainly on the bigger jobs where there is more scope for sort of value engineering, we will try and bring a quantity surveyor or an estimator in at roughly the planning stage. Some clients want to go straight to planning and don't want to worry too much about cost, so we might do it just after planning, but ideally it's before planning, so we can submit a set of drawings and an outline specification to a quantity surveyor. They can give a budget cost for the build. We can ensure that fits within our budget. If it doesn't, what do we need to do to change that? If that affects how the building sits on its site or the exact size or the materials, then we're able to deal with that before we submit for planning, so that we don't have the impact of having to review our planning application, either to make a non-material amendment or potentially to have to resubmit at a later date. And then hopefully that price is accurate enough that when we get our tender prices back, they're roughly commensurate with that price. I mean, we don't always tender. It's not what we think is the best way of procuring a building. We like to collaborate with builders or contractors. So we would ideally, if we've got an independent kind of budget quotation, we would ideally work with a contractor, get a contractor we want to work with, that the client's happy to work with, to buy into achieving the building at that price. And then we work with them to ensure that the design and the specification, as it goes through detailed design, matches that budget. And they give us that expertise then of being able to hopefully deliver certain elements of the build more cheaply without any loss in quality, appearance, performance. And they will flag up to us where there are things that perhaps we might need to amend them to bring things in on budget. So we find that a more preferable way of working. And so we actually incentivize that in our fees, and we charge less for a negotiated price with the contractor than we would do for dealing with a full tender process.
Does that mean you tend to use a smaller pool of builders?
Yes. So we have a handful of builders that we work with more regularly. Still occasionally do tender processes, and they can be very useful in the sense that they can expose us to builders that we've not worked with before, who we might actually end up having very positive experiences with. So that can be positive. And often a client will say, well, I know this builder, we've worked with them before on another extension, or they've done something for our friends and they were really impressed, so we'd like to use this builder. So our pool of builders will change. Occasionally, a builder that we've had confidence in before, they've changed the way they work, and perhaps we might have less confidence in them. So we might sort of take people off our list, but then we tend to be in a position where we try and grow it so that we have a larger pool, because the really good contractors are really difficult to get hold of. We're booking some sort of 2 years in advance at the moment, which can be disappointing for clients as well. That expectation of time is it can be as equally as important as cost. And they kind of have a vision of when they might be in their new building, or when their extension might be complete, and to be told, well, the contractor we really want to work with, or that will do the very best job here, is not available for another year, can be quite hard. But I think most clients come round to the fact that if they want the very best product, they want the very best people to do that. So yeah, That is a challenge. One of our biggest challenges actually is, especially as we're delivering kind of very high performance buildings quite often, contractors who are kind of already skilled or used to doing that, or those that are willing to engage with that and that we are confident will take our advice on doing a good job. Because it's very easy for a contractor to say, yeah, we can do air tightness. And then when they don't do it very well, to not take that criticism very well and not kind of rectify it to a degree that we'd be happy with. So yes, it's a constant struggle, that, unfortunately.
Is this a downside of going down the design and build process? Because we're going to tender, and that's obviously one of the first things that you're going to ask them, are you available in the next couple of months? Whereas with this, you've got to engage with that builder a bit, and the process might take a while.
Yes. I mean, as I say, most builders that we work with, by their very nature, they're busy because they're good, and so yes, their availability might be quite some way down the line, but because we are engaging them much earlier in our process. So I'll give you an example. We've got a large extension and retrofit in Sheffield that we are doing the detailed construction drawings and specification for now. We've already had a price back from a quantity surveyor that fits with our budget, and we've already agreed an approximate start date with the contractor for next year. So we're able to take our time on those drawings, feed those back through to the contractor, and we have that sort of buy-in on budget, buy-in on timescales. So by the time we're ready and the contractor's ready, everything's sort of joined together. It doesn't always work that perfectly. Tender processes can also have similar drawbacks. A tender process takes 4 to 6 weeks. You then have a process of reviewing the prices, potentially calling tenderers in for a conversation, maybe an interview. You might have some value engineering to do. And once you've gone through all of that process, the contractor's picked up another job that pushes him his availability another year down the line. So yeah, it is a constant struggle, and there are benefits and drawbacks to both routes. Our biggest difficulty with tendering is that there's normally a wild card in there, just by the nature of the number of contractors that we know are really good. We're always trying to find one or two others to make sufficient numbers to put together a tender package of people that are available at a particular time. And as I say, that sometimes exposes us to really good contractors, but it quite often exposes us to someone who's willing to be a lot cheaper than everyone else. And it's very, very difficult for a client to ignore, quite naturally, if someone's 10, 20% cheaper than everyone else, it's really difficult to say, oh, well, I can just ignore that and go to someone that I know will do a really good job. And you might find that the really cheap guy does an excellent job, but normally, if it's too good to be true, it probably is. And it might mean that by the time you finish the job, you've spent the same amount as everyone else would have charged you, but you've had to deal with a process of extras and kind of more, you had to be kind of more aggressively cost controlling to deal with the way that they then manage their project on site. So that's the biggest drawback for us. If we could definitely be comparing apples with apples every time, and we know that every single one of the tenderers is an excellent contractor and is likely to produce a similar result on site, that would be great. I mean, what we tend to find, if that's the case, is that they're only a matter of a few £100 in between them, and then it comes down to which do you prefer. And if that's the question, which do you prefer, then we could have avoided 2 or 3 contractors having to put a price together in the first place, and just gone with the one and negotiated that cost. So yeah, it's a difficult process, and we have to discuss the pros and cons with every client and give them as much information as we can to allow them to make that decision.
Well, this is where I'm at the moment. We're out to tender, so I will watch with interest as they come back and we open up all of those projected figures. Slightly nerve-wracking, we'll see. A couple more things, and then we'll wrap up. One of them, just going back to that land equation, where it's land cost plus build cost plus 20 to 30% profit is less than or equal to the value of the finished house. So when we say build cost, do we really mean build cost there? Because we've talked about all these other things. Is build cost saying everything, the landscaping, the contingency, the utility costs, all of these things that have come into our conversation today?
I would say so, yes. I mean, we are often talking about, when we're talking with clients about build cost, we are often kind of separating out the build cost of the building plus then landscaping and utilities and things. But if you're talking about the whole project, then yes, I think build cost is all of that.
You find that people say, oh, well, how big is it going to be? 200 square meters. Well, let's do this at £1,500 per square meter or £2,000 a square meter. And that's your figure. That's how I did it. Is that wrong then?
It depends on what your figure is. At £1,500 a square metre, I would say that it is just the building. And if you've got extensive groundworks, that's why we've added in our sort of factoring of slope. So if you've got extensive work below the ground, that could actually rise. It doesn't include landscaping. You potentially could have 1,000 metres squared of landscaping very easily. And that can't included in a square metre rate for a 200 square metre house. It would be impossible. But if you were looking at £2,000 a square metre, it's likely that it would encapsulate all of that. So it depends on the rate that you're dealing with. But I'd be wary of thinking that it covers absolutely everything, because there's just too many variables outside that. So the cost calculator we've put together kind of takes the building cost as one element with a couple of different sort of factors that you kind of tweak. We then look at bathrooms and kitchens as sort of separate elements with levels of specification, and then landscaping on top of that, or external works on top of that.
Well, let's finish up today with an example, because I know is it a couple of years ago that you entered the self-build on a shoestring project?
Yes. So this is NACSPA, so it's National Self-Build and Custom Build Association. They've run since 2013. They've run an annual competition called Self-Build on a Shoestring with slightly different sort of briefs each time. And so we have entered a number of them, but the one we have discussed in the past, and the one that you're looking at, is our entry from the first year, so 2013, where they asked for a detached family home on a very simple flat plot for £50,000 or less. That £50,000 didn't include things like utility connections. It was assumed that they were already in place, but it did include all materials and all specialist labour. So the way that we approached it was that we said, well, we're going to make a simple construction that can be built by the average self-builder, but we will allow where necessary. So if you've got, and we have an MVHR system in the project, so you'll need to get that commissioned. We have electrics in the project. You will need to get those certified. Likewise with your gas installation. So we allowed some specialist bits of input, but ultimately it's kind of a materials only cost. There's a bit of money in there for a digger for a couple of weeks and some scaffolding, but other than that, it's the cost of materials. So we designed a 70 square metre family home for £45,000 from what I remember, and that was designed to Passive House. So we put that through the Passive House planning package, and it was a very easy site in that regard. But yes, we delivered a building that achieved Passive House for less than £50,000 and would be a compact but very comfortable single family home.
Finally then, just looking at this example, we'll include some details in the show notes. What tips do you have for someone that's thinking, well, I want to keep my build cost to £50,000? What was in that mentality that meant you knew, by and large, you're going to fall in under that?
Well, I think the first thing to say, because as I just said, it's because it's a materials only cost. I think if you've got a low budget, you have to be willing to input something yourself, whether that's physical graft or whether that's project management. But yes, you can make significant savings by removing a main contractor from the project. It does increase your risk to a degree, but if you've got a sort of a manageable construction method, then that risk doesn't need to be too great. But in terms of the main design, as you say, we made something that was legible in terms of its construction technology. So it was a very simple softwood timber frame. And then we tried to minimize the number of materials, or kind of conversely, let's say, maximize the function of each of the bits of the construction. So we used oriented strand board, OSB or Sterling board, as our airtight layer. So that's the layer, that's the barrier that's stopping air leakage from the building. But we also left that exposed as our internal wall linings, and it was also a structural element, so it was stopping the building sort of twisting. So it was our racking board as well. So we had 3 functions from one material, whereas quite often you'll have a racking board in there, you'll have an air tightness membrane or a vapor control layer, and then you'll have plasterboard with skim and paint. So we tried to think, right, what is this material doing? How can we maximize what it's doing? And we found that the building, as proposed, is clad in sort of fibre cement slates and timber cladding. The timber cladding was hugely more expensive than the slates. So there would have been a greater or reduced cost had we gone all slates, or you could choose even simpler and cheaper materials. And generally, the larger the format of the material, so the bigger the sheet of it, generally the cheaper it is, because the production costs for that one item are lower, but also your installation costs, especially if you're paying someone else to do it, they're covering a much larger area in one hit than if they're putting lots of small tiles, and also the more systemized something is. So at the moment we've got a project on site which has got cedar shingles on the roof, which are a beautiful product. They're not hugely expensive on their own, but because every cedar shingle is different, there's a sort of element of craftsmanship that is required to arrange those on the roof so that you get the very best protection from the weather. Whereas if you've got an interlocking concrete tile, it's a slightly cheaper product, but also you know exactly where you're putting one after the other, and there's less thought, so it's quicker and therefore cheaper to install.
Paul, you brought a lot of value to the podcast. Thank you, sir.
No problem.
Head online to take a look at the show notes that accompany today's session, houseplanninghelp.com/194, where you can review the main information because we provided a summary for you. Also, you can take a look at the plans that we were talking about, Paul's self-build on a shoestring entry. If you have a comment or you'd like to ask a question, or maybe even your own input, how to keep track of those costs, then add that at the bottom of the show notes. We'll link you to Paul's website, of course. Also show you where he is on Twitter. All of that at houseplanninghelp.com/194. So, you know I run The Hub, which is a membership website for British self-builders. Well, I wanted to finish today by answering this question. What is a membership website? Yes, sometimes maybe I assume the whole world knows what membership communities are. Well, no. So it's time to explain it, particularly if you're not a member of one already. Generally, the common trait is they provide a solution to a problem or perhaps help you achieve an outcome. And for us, it's all about simplifying the self-build journey, being your guides, providing you with the resources that you need and the support, and also getting you in an environment of people that are really doing it, not just talking about it, those that are going through it. And the interesting thing about the membership model is I think it's getting more and more popular, and a lot of businesses are moving in this direction. So if you're interested in membership communities, there's a great book by Robbie Kelman Baxter called The Membership Economy. And you can just see why it's so good, because it gives you that opportunity to leverage your skills and to help more people. So for me, it's all about making videos and trying to map out that process so that it saves you time, probably money as well, and just makes it more enjoyable. I'm a big fan of Mark Brinkley's book, The House Builder's Bible. Really, what I'd like to do is create the online version, the video form of that, so that you can just get straight to what you need to. I know it's work in progress and will be work in progress for many years. Hopefully, though, each day it gets better and more effective. So if you haven't found out more information about the Hub, why not do it this very second? Head to houseplanninghelp.com/join. That's it for another session. Thank you for being there. The House Planning Help podcast is produced by Regen Media, content that matters.